Hello, everyone, both here and afar. Welcome to the Department of Linguistics MLK Symposium Special Colloquia featuring Mr. Jarrett Hill. My name is Jessie Grieser. I'm an associate professor in the department and the newest member of the faculty, and happy to be home. Just a few reminders for the folks in the room and the folks who are online. For the folks in the room, we are streaming and recording, so as you ask your questions, be aware that they will be picked up so that the folks online can hear you. For those of you who are joining us remotely, you will find that closed captioning is available for you via real-time human transcription. To enable those, just click the CC at the bottom of the screen. And as much as possible, we'll conduct the Q&A session for those of you attending remotely via the hand-raising function. So you can click the raise hand button under reactions at the bottom of the screen, wait for us to call your name, and then we will promote you to a panelist so that you can ask your question. For those of you who are in the room, we will field questions with a physical hand-raising reaction, which may feel weird by now. If you have any technical issues, you can send it to us via the chat. And I'll grab the next slide. By way of acknowledging those whose land we are on, the Department of Linguistics recognizes the University of Michigan's origins in a land grant from the Anishinaabe, including the Odawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi, and Wyandot. The university continues to exist on the historical territorial land of the Anishinaabe people. Odawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi are collectively called Anishinaabemowin and belong to the Algonquin language family. There are currently 12 recognized Anishinaabe tribes in the state of Michigan, and many Anishinaabe people living throughout the state and interacting at the University of Michigan. And it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Mr. Jarrett Hill. Jarrett Hill is an award-winning journalist, writer, and professor. He currently serves as the president of the National Association of Black Journalists of Los Angeles. In that position, Jarrett has advocated for diversity in newsrooms, for fair treatment of journalists with law enforcement, and has worked as a leader in a statewide coalition of journalists on Senate Bill 98, signed into law by Governor Gavin Newsom in 2021. Jarrett co-hosts Fanti from Maximum Fun with Travell Anderson, which was chosen as one of Apple Podcasts' Best of 2020. And it's pretty tops, y'all. You gotta put it in your feed. If you wanna pull out your phone right now, go ahead and do that. The show covers pop culture and politics with an intersectionality nuanced eye. And along with Anderson, Jarrett's book, Historically Black Phrases, will be published in 2023 by Penguin Random House's 10-Speed Press. Jarrett is a professor at the University of Southern California's Annenberg School of Journalism. Prior to becoming a professor, he's been a guest speaker and lecturer at the University of California, Berkeley, Columbia University, and many others, and now adding the University of Michigan to that esteemed list. In 2016, Jarrett made international headlines after breaking the story of Michelle Obama's speech being plagiarized by Melania Trump at the 2016 Republican National Convention. I don't know about y'all, but that's where I met you. He was named later that year to the 2016 Ebony Power 100. Jarrett contributes to MSNBC, NBC News, CNN, and many others, with bylines in the New York Times, Variety, NBC BLK, NBC Out, and many others. Jarrett co-hosted Drop the Subject, a nationally syndicated daily show on Audacity's Channel Q, the United States' first national FM LGBTQ+ radio station. Additionally, he hosted and produced the network's special coverage of the 2020 election on Debate Night with Jarrett Hill. Jarrett attended Clark University in Atlanta, Georgia, studying mass media in radio, TV, and film. And while he was in Atlanta, he worked with CNN Presents in long-form documentaries, NBC News affiliate WXIA 11 Alive News, AIDS Walk Atlanta, Sirius XM Satellite Radio, and later he was a reporter at WFTS ABC Action in Tampa Bay as part of the Scripps nationwide launch of the Now franchise. In 2020, Jarrett founded Troublemaking to coalesce his 20 years of media and journalism experience into DEI-centered media training and consulting. Named in tribute to the ideas about angelic troublemakers and good trouble of Bayard Rustin and John Lewis, respectively, Troublemaking is multifaceted, encompassing work in creative production, and consulting. His work has paired him with campaigns for CBS Studios, CBS TV, Showtime, the CW, Paramount Plus, Warner Brothers, OWN, the Oprah Winfrey Network, and various private clients. Jarrett was gracious to join us today and to meet me at 9 o'clock in the morning, which was 6 o'clock his time, coming to us from all the way from California. Please welcome Jarrett Hill.
Thank you. Appreciate it. I am a firm believer that there's nothing worse than having to follow your own bio because it makes you sound so cool and then you got to follow that. So thank you very much for having me. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. I really do appreciate it. I want to jump in here. I'm curious, how many of you went to church as a kid? Yes, okay. How many of you still go to church? A little bit? Handful? Okay. How many of you can tell how church has influenced your life? Tell me how.
A lot of the times it has influenced.
Can we get the microphone? Right here? Or this one here? As we're thinking about this, I want y'all to think about how church has influenced y'all. I've been meeting with some of you all today and kind of getting the opportunity to meet some of your faculty and team members here, and I've kind of reworked what I was doing after kind of getting to talk with y'all a little bit, and I'm curious about how church has impacted your life. So, well, what's your name and how did church impact you?
Hi, I'm Nick, and I do think that going to church regularly as a kid definitely influenced me into wanting to, made me want to be a kinder person, which I am grateful for, but I think it also made me very conscious of the use of formalized language and how that can be used against people.
Such an answer from a linguist. Yes, okay.
I don't know, yeah.
All right. How did you go to church?
No, I'm just gonna pass the microphone.
Okay, I saw another hand.
Yeah, Lawali.
Say your name and tell us, how did church impact you?
I am Holowale, and the church has impacted me in the way of how I view what is right from what is wrong.
Distinguishing what's right from wrong.
Yeah.
And developing beliefs around that.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's have one more person. Who else can say how church may have impacted who you've become? I see a hand here.
I'm Hannah. I guess a similar thing to what he said, my morals, for sure, yeah.
Okay, and how you see the world and what's right, what's wrong, what's good, what's bad, those kinds of things, right? I think about this from a pretty personal lens. So this is me now, but like this was me then, right? So I kind of want to talk from his perspective a little bit as I'm thinking about this, and how Black church influenced me specifically. Let's reshare here. Make sure that the Zoom folks can see. How we doing? Is that good? All right, I see a thumbs up. I wanted to kind of make this a little bit more personal than I was initially thinking, but as I think about how church has impacted me, I think about like the 10-year-old Jarrett and how church influenced him and ultimately influenced me. In one of my one-on-ones today, someone asked me what my favorite song from church was. And that's been sitting with me for weeks, months, years. I've been thinking about that and the songs that are really important to me and have impacted me over the years. And I wanted to share a little bit of one of my favorites. It's called Thank You, and you can check out. I'm not going to play the whole song because this is a 16-minute video, as Black churches want to do, but I'll just give you a couple of moments of it.
Tragedies are commonplace, all kinds of diseases, people are slipping away. The economy's down, people can't get enough pay. As for me, all I can say is thank you, Lord, for all you've done for me. Folks without homes, living out in the streets, and the drug habits, some say they just can't be. Muggers and robbers, no place seems to be safe, but you've been my protection every step of the way. I'm gonna say thank you, Lord, for all you've done for me. Yeah. It could have been me, outdoors, no food, no clothes, or just alone, without a friend, or just another number with a tragic end.
So,
But you didn't see it to let none of these things be.
pull this down a little bit. So this is probably, I'll say, in my top 3 songs, depending on the day that you find me, right? The song is called Thank You. It's performed by an incredible woman who is now Bishop Yvette Flunder. She is a Black queer minister in Oakland, and she is dynamic and extraordinary. I've had her on a couple of different shows that I've hosted over the years. She has a very progressive view on God, on faith, and religion. A view that I wish that I would have had access to as a kid. As a queer person, she's able to see God and faith and religion in a way that, as a kid, the little 9-year-old version of me would have really benefited from, right? I, as little 9-year-old Jarrett, I joke about this often, but I always say, like, I have been gay my whole life. And you people knew it. And you're probably wondering, who is you people, right? You people for me is these people. This is my family, right? I love this photo because we are standing outside of our church. This is my dad's side of the family, right after my parents divorced. And we were standing outside of our church. My grandmother, who you'll see there in the middle, is the matriarch of our family, and she's no longer with us. She recently passed. And you'll see there in the middle my grandfather and my grandmother. My grandmother was the person who kind of kept us all going to church and kept us engaged and involved. We went to a church called Independent Holiness Church. That was a church that was ran by my grandmother's brother, my uncle, Tommy Bradford. His wife, First Lady Juanita Bradford, they both passed away a number of years ago. And being a part of that church as a kid, I was only there until I was about 6 or 7. Then we moved to the Bay Area, until I was about 9. We moved to another part of the Bay Area, and we started going to a different church where we had a different pastor and a whole other community. And like that really kind of developed my Christianity, right? My faith, the way that I looked at the world. Reverend Claiborne Lee Sr. was our pastor when I moved to Fairfield, California. And he was an older man who was transitioning out of his role and transitioning his son into the pastoral care there. As a kid, I always felt something was like a little bit different about me, but I wasn't really clear what that was. I didn't have language for it. I didn't know exactly how to name that. But it was interesting to me because I always felt like I knew that something about me was not okay with God, with church, with faith, with what I was being taught, but I didn't have language for that. And then as I got older, I learned that, oh, I'm queer, I'm gay, right? That's what this thing is called. And I would then spend another decade arguing with God, pleading with God, begging, all of the different ways that we communicate with God when we want something, to like take it away. That ain't happen, right? Because I'm still queer and still here, right? And so it was challenging for me to figure out like how I'm supposed to move in the world. And we talked about how going to church was like a really important part of how we figured out our morals and our values, right? And like what was right and what was wrong. But it was challenging being so conflicted by that. I see a head nod, like maybe you understand what I mean. It was challenging because I felt like something about me was wrong. We talk about the distinctions between guilt and shame, right? Guilt about something that you've done, shame about being who you are. I had shame about who I was and how I showed up in the world and how I was moving through the earth. And I eventually started finding myself backing away from church. It was challenging for me because I'd grown up in church my whole life. I believed in God. I always make distinction between God, faith, and religion. Those things being distinctly different for me. God being the creator, who we look to, who we aspire to please. Faith being about believing in the thing, right? Believing in God, believing in what we've been told or what we read or how we engage. And then religion being about like the set of rules that we've applied to be able to live those lives out, right? That was challenging for me when I started going to other places. When I started going to other churches, other faiths, other faith communities, it was interesting to me because I then started to recognize like I carried a lot of guilt and shame in my body. And I would always be talking about how I felt guilty about something, or I was ashamed of something, or, oh, I couldn't do that thing. I feel so guilty, oh, I'm so sorry. And a friend of mine introduced me to Buddhism, and I was practicing Buddhism for a while. And I remember not being able to make it to a meeting one day. And I was like, oh, I'm so sorry, I feel guilty, I have to do this thing and another thing, and all of this different stuff. And he said to me, he was like, Jarrett, there's no guilt in Buddhism. The whole purpose of being Buddhist is to not be Catholic. Which I kind of sat with for a while, like, what does that even mean? But also, thank God, right? I was like really relieved by that a little bit. But it made me start paying attention to how much I was talking about feeling guilty, feeling bad, right? And I started to recognize that like, that was a big part of how church had influenced me. I carried around a lot of guilt because church had found many ways to tell me that I was wrong, I was bad, I was doing the wrong thing. Then I think about this song that I love, right? Thank You by Walter Hawkins, performed by Yvette Flunder. And that song has been something that has stayed with me through the years, right? There are various songs that really, really resonate with me, but that song particularly, I remember Jesse talked about how you met me in 2016 when the Melania Trump plagiarism scandal happened. I distinctly remember that week being the most extraordinary week I've had. Monday night, I had a job interview. Monday afternoon, I had a job interview. Monday night, I tweeted that tweet that said, hey, she stole this speech. And that night, my whole life was different. The next morning, I woke up, I did 13 interviews on television, in print, and throughout the rest of the week, I was all over the place. I was doing interviews in other countries, back to my hometown. It was a lot. By the end of that week, I was headed to the Democratic National Convention in Philadelphia. I went to Target because, one, I was a laid-off journalist without very much to my name, but two, I was going to be traveling to Philadelphia and didn't have all the stuff that I needed. Went to Target, picked up some things, and was walking back home, and was feeling like this gratitude around like, wow, what a crazy ass week, God. Like, this has been awesome. And I wanted to like figure out what I was supposed to do, how I was supposed to say thank you for that. And so I started playing the song. As I was walking back home, I'm playing the song and I like burst into tears because it was all I could do to say thank you for what had happened, right? People had said to me like, well, how did you know that she plagiarized that speech? How did you come up with that? And I was saying to them like, had you asked me 5 minutes before that tweet, what did Michelle Obama say in 2008 at the Democratic National Convention? I would have been like, why are you asking me, right? Like, I don't know. But I also said to them, when they asked me those questions, oftentimes, like, it was certainly a God moment. The fact that I remembered this one statement that she'd said and then was able to translate that into tweets and research and breaking a story, it was certainly a God moment. It wowed me in ways that I still can't explain. At the Republican National Convention, there were 1,300 journalists in the room, from what I'm told, and none of them broke that story from having the transcript of the speech in front of them. It was certainly a God moment, not a Jarrett is brilliant moment. So I want to be clear about that, even with the great bio that I just got a few minutes ago. It was undoubtedly a moment that was divine and blessed for me. I think about this song and how it speaks to me all the time, and how it has influenced me to think about gratitude, to think about God, to think about blessings, to think about all of the many, many blessings that I've been given over the years that Jesse was just reading about. I am always thinking about how the things that we do every day, the places that we go, the people we give our attention and time, how they influence us, how they redirect the ways that we think, the ways that we move, the ways that we show up. One of the examples I was talking about recently with a friend was like, I'm always curious about how living in an apartment influences me. I live in Los Angeles. I have people that live beneath me, and I find myself walking through my apartment softly, often days. Not walking, right? I am like walking sometimes, and sometimes like on my toes, just because I don't want to like piss off the neighbors downstairs. Now, mind you, my neighbors downstairs, they said something to me one time 5.5 years ago in the hallway. I've seen her 3 times in 6 years. She was like, oh, you live upstairs. Oh, you're the one that be walking all heavy. And I was like, what? Ever since, I have been like walking, right, on the balls of my foot and trying to not be that neighbor. That's had an influence on me that has been immeasurable to me. Because now when I have friends come over, I'm always like aware of how loud they are, especially my black friends. Because sometimes, you know, I see that head nod like, you know, sometimes we can be a little gregarious. Our voices can be a little loud sometimes. They can carry, right? But I'm always thinking about how does like living in this apartment, living in this city, living in this way influence me? How does it impact me? I'm also always thinking about how being a member of a black church, being a part of black communities of faith have impacted how I see myself, how I see the world, and how I see y'all. One of the things that's been interesting to me also has been how church influences black folks in specific. If we just take this from a data perspective, there's Pew Research out that says that, and I mean, I think before I say this, polling is one of those things that we all have mixed feelings about, right? Polling is something that is challenging because we don't know who the people are that they're questioning all the time. I ain't ever been polled about anything, ever, including presidential elections, or, I don't know, maybe a Pew Research poll that says that the majority of black people identify with God in some kind of way, right? This says 94% of non-religious black Americans say they still believe in God or a higher power. 94% is a lot of people, right? 94% of black people believing in God does not mean 94% of black people go to church, right? We've seen data right now that says about a third of Americans identify as spiritual, a third of Americans identify as religious, and a third of Americans are kind of in that space of atheist or not believing, right? But when you think about what it means for 94% of black folks to believe in God or a higher power, it is undeniable that black church has had an impact on black people, right? As we talked here earlier, you all talked to me about how church has helped you establish your values, your morals, what you think of as right and wrong. And if we as black folks have been in black church and been influenced, encouraged, impacted by black church, I've been curious about, well, we always have this conversation about how black folks lead the culture, right? I think black Twitter has been a big part of that in the last, I would say, decade or so. On Twitter, we're able to see something that is really special because we can, as Dr. Ann Charity Hudley, one of the people that we interview in Historically Black Phrases, available September 12th. Dr. Charity Hudley talks about how Twitter has been important because it gives us the opportunity to see people's language written in ways that we didn't have before. Before places like Twitter and social media, it took a lot of different things to see people's words printed, right? If it was in a newspaper, they had to be a journalist, they had to have that job, they had to be edited, there might have been various different eyes that went on to what we were seeing out in the world. If it was a piece of music, right, you probably had to have a label and a producer and all kinds of different things. If you were an artist or whatever different kinds of disciplines you were in where you were putting things out into the world, there was always a bigger barrier to being able to get those things out. But now, with social media, and I'm sitting with many linguists, you understand that we're able to see people writing words. Today we've been talking about, like, one of the major conversations for us throughout the process of writing this book has been like, so how do you write, what? Like, all of the different things that we say that are not just yes, no, what? Today at lunch, we were having a conversation about okay. How do you spell okay? Come on. You smirked. How do you spell okay? How do you spell okay? Yes.
Okay.
How do you, just the letters O and K,
Okay, yes.
right? Is K capitalized?
Not capitalized. O capitalized, K not capitalized.
Oh, okay, okay, all right, all right. Any of you OKAY people? I see a lot of hands. Are any of you OK period people? See, the period's really aggressive, right? You're the OK period?
No, that's me.
I was dating someone that was an OK period, and I was like, it always feels very okay. Like, all right, chill out, right? How many of you are O period K period? We said it was nobody, right? Like, no one uses that. No one is using it, right? But Twitter and social media has been a great way for us to be able to see the ways that people spell different kinds of things. You had like a whole graphic with like the 4 different ways that people spell okay, and it was really fascinating to me. But as we are able to see how people are communicating online, we also start to see the ways that people communicate permeating culture, right? One of the great ways that we can see that right now is TikTok. TikTok is a place where we see all kinds of things happening, whether they are conspiracy theories or dance challenges, right? That's probably as wide as the spectrum goes. Is that right? Like conspiracy theories, dance challenges, and like recipes in the middle, right? I have so many recipes saved that I've never gone back and looked at, different conversation. But as we're looking at social media, we can see how Black creators create a dance, or they create a conversation, and then we see it appropriated in other places without being credited, right? This has actually become a bigger story as we've started to look at the ways that Black creators are working on social media. There's a great documentary an hour-long documentary on Hulu that kind of investigates how Black creators on social media have a different experience than white creators, right? There are whole houses that are built for people who are social media influencers and creators. And it's been fascinating to watch how the Black creators have a fully different experience that are less funded, that get less attention, that are less appreciated or respected for doing something that they may have even created, right? If they've created a dance, for instance, a TikTok challenge dance that you might see on TikTok or an Instagram reel, we oftentimes will see a white creator do that same dance, right, to the same piece of music or using the same audio, and they will go over that and like be able to share it onto their own platforms and get a lot more attention for it, right? Then they end up on Ellen, which is not here anymore, but like they end up on talk shows, they end up on morning shows, they end up all over the place being celebrated like, oh my God, how did you, right? I had to do it one time, but like I'm not doing it again, right? But you have to appreciate that like these things come from somewhere. They don't always just start with the people that we celebrate them for. Black church has been one of those things for me. I remember my aunt telling me that she had just gotten like this white leather couch in her living room because she was able to do that, meaning she didn't have kids in her house anymore. She got this white leather couch and she had a friend come over. The friend brought their child. I heard, oh no. The friend brought their child over. They're in the living room, sitting on one of the couches. My aunt leaves, goes into the kitchen. She gets whatever she's getting. And she comes out and she sees the kid standing on her couch wearing their shoes. I made that face. Oh, I know you lying, right? My aunt's reaction in that moment is, oh, the devil is a lie. And I remember thinking like, oh, the devil is a lie. What an interesting like reaction to have in that moment, right? Like anyone who has been to Black church knows the devil is a lie, or also the modified version, which would be the devil is a liar, which is really where that's born from. The devil is a lie was a thing that like I've never forgotten hearing my aunt walking out of the kitchen, seeing the kid on her couch and saying, oh, the devil is a lie. That actually started something for me. I was like, oh, I've got to do something with, oh, the devil is a lie. It's in the book now. It's in a chapter that we have in Historically Black Phrases called Church, where we are able to take a handful of different phrases from Black church that have found their way out into the culture. Do any of you have any ideas about what those phrases might be? Any of those phrases that you hear out in the world right now that may come from church? Yes. Child. Okay. All right. What else? Can I get an amen? Can I get an amen? Amen. There was about 20% of y'all. That's fine. Tell the truth, shame the devil. How many of you have heard that? No one has heard tell the truth, shame. Just you? Yes. Only you. Tell the truth and shame the devil? It's something that Black folks in church will often say as a way to like tell someone to be honest, right? Tell the truth, shame the devil. Everybody ain't able is something we would say in church all the time. We often talk about when something went really well, like, oh, honey, he showed up and showed out. I see a couple of nods. A couple of you may have been to Black church. I love this one. Whenever someone has gotten a little out of line, maybe said something a little sideways to you, you might say to them, ooh, I wanted to lay hands on her, right? Now, to be clear, to lay hands on a person is not a violent act in church. right? To lay hands on someone is to bless them, right? The bishop, the minister, the preacher might lay hands on someone to bless them, to give them a blessing. In this other scenario, it's not quite a blessing. It's more of an attack, right? Or like a alluding to an attack that might not actually be an attack, right? But like, ooh, I wanted to lay hands on her when she said blank to me. Like, oh, what? Exactly. One of my favorites, my grandfather, who is now dearly departed, we went to a church that my grandmother, she had moved from Independent to another church, and she wanted us to visit the church with her. And so we did. And he was sitting behind us in the back row, and I remember someone being in the spirit. Now, I gotta tell you, if you haven't been to Black church, you might not understand what being in the spirit is. How many of you know what I'm talking about? I'm gonna have to do some explaining here. Okay, to be in the spirit is to be outwardly expressive in your gratitude and your praise and your worship, right? It can be loud, it can be demonstrative, it can be in music, it can be in praise, it can be in worship. It's usually accompanied by sound, right? I remember my grandfather sitting in the back of the church and being like, who is that making all that noise? Can't nobody hear nothing. And I remember thinking like, is he at church telling people not to be in the spirit? Like, how does that even work? What do you mean? My grandfather, one of his favorites was when someone was really well dressed, he'd be like, boy, you casket sharp. I was like, casket sharp? What is that even, what? But I knew what he meant, right? It was adjacent to putting on your Sunday best, right? Kind of the idea that like the last thing that you wear in your casket may be some of your best stuff, right? It may be that real good that you've got. And like my grandfather's language was just always like an interesting thing to me. He was such a storyteller. I think one of the ways that we often hear Black church language nowadays is, won't he do it? Won't he will? There you go, right? I have a feeling for you specifically. If I were to say, God is good all the time, and all the time, God is good. There you go. Black church has had an influence on at least 6 people in this room, right? But as we see Black church finding its way into our day-to-day lives, and then the ways that we go out into the world as Black people and share what we're thinking, share what we're feeling, what we're experiencing, what we've been going through, we use a lot of that language, right? Won't he do it? The devil is a lie. Tell the truth, shame the devil. Y'all don't know that one. It's been interesting to watch how that begins to influence our culture. In the most like recent iterations, we have a lot of daytime talk shows now. 4 of them that are hosted by Black people. Tamron Hall, Sherry Shepherd, Jennifer Hudson, Karamo Brown. I've been fascinated by Sherry Shepherd and Jennifer Hudson because they are incredibly churchy Black women, right? Every episode there is a reference to God, there is a reference to faith, there is all kinds of different references to like belief in oneself, belief in God. That is going out into the world. Every single day, millions of people are hearing Black women, Black people talking about God's influence in their life. Church's influence in their life. But we're also hearing them use these phrases, right? To use this language. In Historically Black Phrases, available September 12th. We just got the date, work with me, okay? But in Historically Black Phrases, we are taking various different kinds of phrases. We have various different chapters. One of them is about church. But all of the different chapters are celebrating the different ways that we've seen Black language affect culture. Our goal has not been to describe how Black people have talked over 400 years into this country. Our goal is not to define jive turkey from back in the day, or the different things that we've heard over the years, we have been taking a snapshot of this moment in history. The things that I've heard my parents say, the things that I've heard my friends say, the things that I heard my auntie say when the kid was on her couch with the shoes on, right? We've been able to take all of those different things and be able to like put them into a book that is able to celebrate this language, but also to write it into history. I'm with a lot of linguists right now. We know that oftentimes language is not appreciated until it is in print somewhere, and not on Twitter, right? There have been various different kinds of ways that we validate words. We use them in certain places and see them going out. We will see so-and-so has added such and such to the dictionary, and that is a way that something gets validity. We've kind of taken the opportunity to like write our own additions to that dictionary, because in this time, these are the things that we have been saying. This is what they mean, and we have some mini essays inside that also give us the opportunity to talk a little bit about where these things come from. Black church has been one of those things that we have an essay called Let the Church Say Amen, of course. And like, it's been fascinating to me because I know that many of you know Dr. Ann Charity Hudley, who has spoken here and is a fantastic linguist. She talked to us about how important it is to respect that Black folks' language is language. It is not just broken English. It is not like a screwed up version of something else, right? It is language. It's important to recognize that because earlier in one of my meetings, we were talking about how languages are endangered, right? There are some languages that are falling away because no one is using them, no one has documented or recorded them, studied them, respected them. To us, it was important that like these things that we have been saying throughout our lives, that they get documented somewhere outside of Twitter, right? That they get the credence that they deserve. Because the ways that we communicate with each other, if I say trouble don't last always, you know what that means. Well, some of you know what that means, right? If I said any kind of different thing that we might find in the book, there are various different Black folks who will either understand what I mean because they've said it themselves, or they've heard someone else say it, they've watched it on television, they've read it in a book. This was our way of being able to honor those things and write them into history and give them validity, right? Because the people at Penguin Random House, right, have said yes and like are helping us write this book. I've been incredibly excited about it and the ways that we can offer something to the world that is celebrating our Blackness, that are celebrating our language, celebrating our culture, and celebrating our history. Overall, I've been really excited to bring this book to market because I've been working on this, I should say, for about 7 years. It started, oddly enough, on social media. She said I could cuss, so I will. I did this definition of the word fuckboy. I was like, describing what it meant, giving an explanation and pronunciation. Then I did another one, and another one, and another one. And like, after about the fourth or fifth one, someone asked me like, are you doing like a book or something? Like, what is this? And I was like, uh-huh, a book. Yeah, that's exactly what I'm doing. That compilation of 7 phrases became about 340 or 50 or so. 200 and some odd will be in the book. But it was exciting to me to be able to kind of take this language that I've heard throughout my life and like do something with it. I talked earlier about my grandfather and Casket Sharp. My grandfather is well known in my family for being a storyteller. His storytelling has translated to my dad's storytelling and my uncle's storytelling. And let me tell you, they are always telling a story. Like every time you engage one of them, they are going to be giving you a story that has a beginning, a middle, and a punchline. It's actually a little bit annoying, not gonna lie. It can be like, okay, Dad, what is it? Yes, no, this is a story. Come on, what you got, right? But in those stories, I hear so many different things that I've heard my entire life. I hear him referring to people in different kinds of ways. I hear him talking about himself in different kinds of ways. He's telling me about the way that he went to the thing, right? The ways that he showed up in this space. The way he told somebody about themselves, right? This has been a really, really exciting way to be able to kind of document that and do something really special with it. I appreciate y'all's time. I know that Jesse's gonna ask some questions here in just a moment, but I would love for y'all to be thinking about like, how have you been influencing and impacting the people that are around you with your language, with your thought processes, with the work that you're doing, with the study that you're doing, with the resources that you have? Earlier today, I was talking with someone about how the work that they're doing matters, right? Preserving languages, studying language, respecting language. It's incredibly important work as we see cultures around the world being celebrated more and more, as we are becoming more and more inclusive of more and more different kinds of people. All that said, thank you. I've got another 15 minutes, but no, I'm kidding. You want to come on up and chat a little bit?
Jarrett, thank you so much.
Yes.
And we'll give one more round of applause. And we're actually ready to take questions from the colloquia. So if you are present in the room, feel free to use your physical react button. If you are
physical react button. I love that.
and if you are joining us on Zoom, you'll see the raise hand under reactions. I see Alexis and Dom first.
We have a mic. Oh.
I'll mic us.
Okay, sounds good. Hello.
Do you want to say your name and your question?
Yes, Alexis, and thank you so much for being here with us. My question was more, what do you think about the idea of the said phrases that you have in your book available September 12th?
I believe that's correct.
Oh, okay, just
Yes,
checking.
thank you.
What do you think about the idea of if it's okay, if it's considered gatekeeping to essentially be saying these words are in this book because they are specifically Black, and how do you feel about someone using it as like a how-to and so they can brag
Really,
with
what
their
you're
friends?
asking me is, what about the white people reading this book?
What about the white people?
What about the white people? Are they going to take this on TikTok? This is actually a really important question. When we first announced this book was coming, I did like a social media post because that's what you're supposed to do. And there's like all these comments, and it's like, oh my God, this is so amazing, and I want to write a book, and all this. And who is this for? I don't know why it was so loud to me, but it was really loud, right? It was them asking me who this book was for, which really resonated to me as like, what about white people, right? And white people reading this and seeing it as an instruction manual on how to talk Black. But the reality of the situation is, if we're just being honest, like, white culture has been able to find all kinds of things that Black folks have done over the years and like been able to make that into something, right? We talked about that with TikTok and the videos and all those different kinds of things, and we've seen that throughout our history here in this country. And so I don't see it as a way of giving a how-to, but anything we do is going to be seen as a how-to. I more see it as us being able to take this opportunity to write something into history, to write something into the ways that, to write these words into history in the ways that we have used them. So thank you for your question. Next question. Yes.
Hello.
You want to say your name and ask your question?
Yeah, I'm Dominique, and my question kind of has to do with like how this might, so some of the phrases that you used in your talk, I don't know from like Black church, but I know from like queer spaces, but also like Black queer spaces.
Sure.
So like, do you have thoughts about how these kind of, how like maybe Black church might be influencing like Black queer language? And I guess like this is an aside, but a lot of my participants were saying that like when they think about Black queer language, they think about like Black Southern women's language. And so like how much of that also might tie into church?
Sure.
Can you write my dissertation for me is really what I'm saying.
Got it. I'm a little busy, but I can maybe answer your question. So when we think about, number one, you talked about Black Southern women, right? One of the interesting things that was a part of writing this book was kind of trying to decipher what the difference between Southern, country, and Black was, right? And I'm actually curious about how you all think about this, but we started to recognize that Southern was distinctly different than country. One, because of like region, right? But like country ended up having like more of like a connection to land and like the ways that we speak here. Whereas Southern sometimes can feel a little uncomfortable for Black folks specifically, right? Southern can sometimes have a little twang of, I'm sorry, what? Right? Southern can sometimes come across as, ooh, that didn't hit quite well in my spirit, right? To that point, we were really looking at the ways that like queer language and Black queer language specifically has permeated culture. We have an essay in the book called, I believe it's Language Lives in the Body. We talk about how Black queer folks' language has been disseminated out in the world in various different ways. And it's odd that you talk specifically about Southern Black women, because oftentimes in our conversations, we think about the Real Housewives of Atlanta, right? And how many of them we've heard saying like so many different things that queer Black folks talk about, or the ways that queer Black folks talk, I should say. Carlos King, who's executive producer of the Real Housewives of Atlanta for a number of years, talked about how he would have conversations with Nene Leakes, and like she would hear how he would say this and that and ooh and and all of those different things, and like started to pick it up, right? And now not all of it comes from him, right? But like being in community with Black queer people tends to have an impact on the people around them. And so it was interesting to me because as we look at how queer culture, kind of Black queer culture tends to permeate, we in the book have a whole chapter of phrases that come from Black queer community. And so it's certainly something that we're thinking about and talking about in the book. So I appreciate the question. Thank you. Any other questions? I see a hand right here.
Hi,
Hi.
I'm Tabitha.
Hi, Tabitha.
And I was kind of touching on, I think, back to your point. I'm completely forgetting your name. Alexis. Okay. So back to your point a little bit, and thinking about how a lot of like slang, especially in like white culture, is definitely coming, or white society is coming from like historically Black phrases, and like what is your like thoughts on that? Because I think like seeing it, I know that like a lot of people don't even acknowledge that it's coming from like Black culture, and kind of like, I don't know how to phrase it, but definitely like, what is your thoughts on that, and like how we should be going about like using that language and using the slang and like things like that?
So really about appropriation and what that looks like and how we should address it. I just saw this video, and it was a Black woman talking about how we do so many things nowadays that would be considered white back in the day. Like, oh, that's really white. Like, oh, my parents would have referenced that as being really white, or at me as a kid would have looked at that as being something white. And like one of the examples that she gave was yoga. And she was like, oh, I'm doing my yoga, I'm eating avocado. Like she had all these different things. And I was like, I don't even know what that was, but like, okay. And her friend stopped her and said, you know, it's interesting to me that you talk about yoga as being something white. because it's not. Where does yoga come from?
India.
Yoga comes from India, right? But like, we look at yoga as like, I should be more distinct. Many people look at yoga as like a very white thing, right? With our Lululemon pants and our, you know, like all of the different things that are associated with like yoga culture, right? And I think it's a really great example of the ways that we've seen like things being appropriated into white culture and then being served back out into the world as white, right? And so I think that white folks have to do more work on like identifying those things and being able to like communicate to people like, this came from a place, right? This is not ours, this is not us, this is something that we're doing or that we appreciate or that we respect. I think when we're thinking about appropriation, we have to just be more clear and more respectful about where things come from, as opposed to acting as if they are ours. Does that make sense? Thank you for your question. Anybody else?
We have
Yes.
a question from one of our anonymous online attendees. Is there a section in the book about hair terms? If so, what is the word you personally use for the hair bows with the balls on them that little black girls usually have in their hair?
Oh my God, knockers? Yeah. Okay, wait, what?
Both of these were produced by the question asker, who identified them as bobos, as knockers, as bubbles, as balls, and a bunch of other terms for them.
That's amazing, number one. Bobos? What is a bobo?
It's obviously a bobo. It looks like a
Okay, first of all, I'm feeling attacked. Thank you, black woman in the back row, for agreeing with me, making me right. First of all, I just want to acknowledge like the throwing of the braids was really aggressive. I would reference them as like barrettes or knockers, and like as I've heard all of those different names, I'm like, I only really recognize two, right? Which is actually a really interesting part of the experience that we had of writing this book. I'm not talking to you right now. I really was fascinated by the way that we often hear black folks talk about we are not monolithic, right? Even if 94% of us believe in God in one way or another. But in the research for this book and interviews, it was fascinating to talk to black folks from different parts of the country. I am from Northern California in the Bay Area. My co-writer is from Charleston, South Carolina. So we have very different like growing up experiences. But we wanted to talk to people in the book that had various different kinds of experiences between ours, right? We were looking specifically at American black language because we also know that that can vary from region to region and country to country. But it was interesting because we did a focus group with our friends after the book was done, right? We got everyone together and broke up the chapters and put it all over the house. We had food, not chicken. And I mean, there was a black comment coming about food. I could feel it in my spirit. We got to everyone together and we were asking them to like go through the chapters and give us their feedback. It was interesting because there were moments in the book where people were like, oh my God, my mom been saying this my whole life, triggered, or whatever, right? Like, oh, I love this. I say this all the time. Or, oh, this is definitely something you are always saying. And then there were some people who would see that same exact phrase and say like, what is this? Or I've never heard this said that way before. That was interesting to me because I was really intrigued by the diversity of blackness, right? I often reference black diversity because I think it is so important to recognize that like black folks are not only not monolithic, but we are diverse, right? I do a lot of diversity, equity, and inclusion training. And one of the first things I like to remind people that diversity is in and of itself diverse. Diversity is not just about having like a black person and a white person, like a lot of black churches will. We are a multi-ethnic congregation. It's like there's a white lady on the website with her hands raised, right? Doesn't make you a multi-ethnic congregation, right? But like diversity is diverse. It is not just about black and white. There are many different ethnicities and nationalities in there as well. It's not just about race and ethnicity and nationality, it's also about gender. It's about sexuality, it's about expression, it's about the ways that we show up, right? And so it was exciting for me to get to talk to various different kinds of Black folks about their experiences with this language. So thank you for the question. Do we have another question? Yes. You want to say your name and ask your question?
My name is Isabel. I had actually an answer. What did it feel like when you said that the church, your like grandfather or whatever, was like saying something really loud in the church?
I will say when I was in church, I was probably like 25, and I thought my grandfather was probably the most entertaining thing happening in church. He was funny without trying to be, which made it even funnier. You know how someone can be really funny and they don't know they're being funny? He was that guy in that moment because he was upset and we were all like, how are you possibly saying that out loud? But like my grandfather, his language was always something so interesting and unique, and like I've now seen it, and my dad and my uncles, they all talk very much like him now, so. Why was he so funny? I don't know. I don't even think he really worked at it, to be honest. I think it was effortless. But he's just a really fun. How loud was he? Isabel, I love this. Isabel's like, why was he so loud? I don't know why he was so loud, but I would guess that it was because he was a truck driver. He worked in a lot of different kinds of ways where he probably had to make sure that his voice carried, but also like, you know, some people are just loud. Yeah. Another question?
All right, y'all, if Isabel can ask a question, all
Any
of y'all
others?
can ask y'all's questions.
As we wrap up, I guess, if we don't have any other questions, last
Anyone?
chance.
Nothing
Yes.
from him.
I was wondering if we could hear a little bit more about what you learned about the history of Black people by studying the language. Like, what are some stories that popped out when you were looking at these expressions and studying the language? Like, what did you learn?
Yeah. So part of this was interesting to me because I mentioned like I've had many moments over the course of 6.5, almost 7 years now of writing this book where I've like had a panic moment, like, oh my God, did we remember to put this in the book? And so many times I've had that, and I've been like, oh, did we do this the right way? Did we ask enough questions? Did we have enough conversation? The thing that I was affirmed in and learned was about our Blackness specifically, and like how differently it shows up for people. I've been really fascinated that even today, we were talking earlier about being Black, but being raised by a white family, and how that has an impact on how you see the world and how you engage with people, right? Or in our book, we did an interview with folks who often said like, or not often, but a few different times said like, I was Black, I had a Black family, but I grew up in a predominantly white area, right? There weren't a whole bunch of Black folks. And it highlighted for me that like Twitter wasn't the only way that we were able to see language and all those things being able to kind of permeate culture, but we've also heard those folks say to us like, the only thing I had was like those 3 TV shows, or I was listening to X music, and that was my connection, or I read this book, right? It was really illuminating to me because like I grew up in the Bay Area where it's pretty diverse in a lot of different ways, but my Black experience was uniquely different than my co-host / co-author's experience in Charleston, South Carolina. So I both learned and was affirmed in the ways that we had conversation with people about how they engaged their Black experience and this language. So thank you for that.
So hi, thank you for the talk.
Absolutely.
Okay, so this is going to be a very difficult question.
Uh-oh.
You said something about diversity, and you said diversity is not only about gender or race or sex, it's about also expression.
Sure.
So, a question from a Palestinian, I want to be a linguist, to a journalist. What do you think about like the pursuits of the top-notch journalist here in the US to kind of reverse what's happening in Palestine using the language, like to kind of reverse what is actually happening to make the oppressed really oppressors?
I don't have a lot of information on specifically what you mean about like reclaiming of language. Is that what you're talking about?
No, it's about like, for example, I don't want to mention specific like news agencies, but for example, in 2021, they attempted really hard to kind of hide what is really happening or what was happening in Gaza. They used the language per se to kind of make what is happening as a kind of a conflict, a struggle between two equal parties, not between like the most strongest army in the world against people who have nothing. Like, I think you might, there are many articles which were very pivotal in this struggle. So as a journalist, what do you think about this issue?
You know, I'm not super educated on this specific issue, so I don't want to give you an answer because I'm up here with a microphone and lights on. The thing that is coming up for me is about the reclamation of language and how we take language and make it something different. In one of our chapters, we talk about, we have a kid in here and I'm realizing I did say a cuss word earlier. I just got a thumbs up, great. In the book, we talk about the reclamation of language and how we can change what it means and how we often see that come from oppressed groups, right? If we talk about black folks, it might be the N-word. If we talk about women, it might be the B word. If we talk about queer folks, it might be various different words, right? But like oftentimes we see that kind of reclamation when there's a group that is being oppressed by another and taking that language back and making it into something that is positive or that is not harmful or that is not as frustrating or upsetting as the way that it was used against them. That was actually to the question earlier about what did I learn. That was something that was really interesting to me, but also it moved me to see that we've seen this throughout history where cultures and groups of people can take language and make it mean something for themselves. So I don't have a whole bunch on that specifically, but that is definitely what comes up for me as we're talking about kind of like the taking of language and making it something else. Anybody else? Yes.
There we go. So I guess circling back around to the idea of church, I grew up in a very traditional Catholic, very traditional Catholic family, and then we moved to the South Bend area where Notre Dame is, and I, by and large, primarily interacted with white Catholic culture growing up. I guess what I'm curious about, bringing up my own experience there, is how do you think black church language might have influenced white church language even when black people aren't present? Because I'm sure that it had to have, but I obviously don't have the lived experience to know what it is that might have been drawn on. I'm sorry if that was too broad of a question.
No, it's not too broad of a question. It's that's difficult. I would say that that's difficult because I think that when we think about how white Christianity moves in our culture, one, white Christianity is really challenging for a lot of people of color specifically, right? The ways in which Christianity has been used to harm black and brown folks or to justify a lot of different things, right? Is its own unique and challenging area. As far as how black language has affected white church, that's something I really want to sit with a little bit longer. I think that we've seen churches becoming more and more integrated and seeing how our churches are becoming more non-denominational, a lot more diverse and inclusive in ways that really tend to only center around race and gender, right? Not necessarily around cultures being able to kind of feel seen and appreciated and respected. Certainly not sexuality in a lot of different places. So that's challenging, but I definitely see how our churches are becoming more diverse and how cultures are starting to mix, or as we would say, as a linguist might say, like starting to have contact, right? Look at me using linguist language. Aren't you proud? Okay, do we have any other questions here? Did you have a question? Yes. Let's use the mic so they can hear you on Zoom. Oh, they got you.
Just wondering, this is more about your personal journey, how you found a way to reconcile your queerness with being part of the church, if you have found a way.
Yeah. In one of the conversations I was having with a student earlier today, we were talking about how we reconcile our identities with faith. And like, part of that is queerness, but part of it is being male, right? Part of it is being black because of the ways we've seen faith used for black folks, for queer folks, against women. I think it's always important to recognize like Christianity and the Bible is inherently patriarchal and misogynistic, right? And like as a man, I'm always thinking to myself, like as a man who is a feminist, I'm always thinking to myself like, what is that about, right? Or we need to talk more about that. As a queer person, I have had a very difficult time throughout my life figuring out like what God means about me, right? And how God is embracing me or not. I have seen over the years a lot of conversation around the ways in which faith communities, various different faith communities within Christianity address queerness differently, right? Throughout my own spiritual journey, I have been immersed in Buddhism. I went to an Episcopal church for a number of years, and like Episcopalians embrace queer folks in a very different way than like Baptist folks would, for instance, right? The challenge for me even today, because I still am really challenged by that, by feeling embraced, not about how I see myself, is one, knowing that I am affirmed by God in other communities, even if I'm not at this church, right? I currently am at a church where sometimes the conversation I'll be like, I don't know about that, right? But like I've also found that to be true every church I've gone to, right? Absolutely, right? And so as I'm like reconciling my queerness, like I think about Bishop Yvette Flunder, who we saw earlier, right, in the clip that I played. Yvette Flunder is a lesbian woman who runs a church in Oakland and is like very sex positive, very queer positive, and we can see how the hermeneutic and the study of the Bible and Christianity shows up in various different kinds of ways throughout Christianity. So I hope that answers your question. Thank you. Yes.
Got another question from online, which we teed up and practiced a little bit earlier over lunch, which is, tell us about your use of lowercase letters. And
I see what you did there. Okay.
To make that your practice.
I should have known that coming to a school of linguists, I would get asked about the lowercase letters. In 2020, I wrote a piece that will be in my seemingly next book, if my agent gets what she wants. My memoir, I wrote this piece called I Feel Different, which was me interrogating myself about how I write and the ways that I engage writing specifically. I dropped out of college in my last year, and I carried a lot of trauma, a lot of pain around that, a lot of shame, a lot of guilt. And in turn, because of that, I ended up like, I would over-comma the hell out of a sentence. I would make sure that I was using all the punctuation, all the grammar, all of the different things, right? To make sure that people knew I was smart, right? And like, it was a frustrating thing because I would do it and do it and do it, and then I would like overdo it to the point that it was really frustrating and upsetting. And I had all these friends two of them specifically who wrote, and they always wrote in lowercase. And I was like, wow, they've made like this statement about, they're making this statement against the man, whoever the guy is, right? And I was really curious, like, oh, what is that about? And so I asked them about it. I was like, hey, I've noticed for years that you write this way, and I want to know, because I've been thinking about writing this way, but it's difficult because I'm a writer, and I'm not supposed to write that way, and I'm supposed to write in AP style, I'm supposed to write in this style. And I asked them, and both of their answers were very much like, oh, I just like writing like that. And I was so let down and disappointed. I was like, you don't have like some manifesto about like, I ain't doing that no more, right? And it really like, it irritated me, right? And I was like, oh, well, I want to write this way because I want to reject this idea that I have to show up in the world a certain kind of way. And so I started writing in all lowercase. My name will be in lowercase in print on the book. My acknowledgments will be written in lowercase in the book as well. And like, it is something I started doing, and like, it felt weird to be writing in lowercase, but not write my name in lowercase. And so I always spell it in title case. And then it became a way for me to be able to show the rejection of those norms without having to be a writer, right? Without it requiring a title, without it being in an article. It was a way for me to be able to like reject that norm with just my name. And so my parents will probably always write my name in title case, and I can deal with that. But like spelling my name in lowercase has been something that I've been doing now for about 2 years after making that transition for myself. So yeah, it's been a rejection. It's a political thing for me. And I think it looks cooler, so there's that.
Tremendous. And we do have another participant online who would like to ask a question. And so, Savoya, you may unmute and join when ready.
Savoya, can you hear me? So Savoya is going to join us in a moment. I actually met Savoya as one of my one-on-ones earlier, a little bit earlier today. I just got she's here.
I don't think the in-person folks can hear me.
We can hear you.
Oh, okay. Okay, hey. Thank you so much for this presentation. I'm going to ask this question, but it seems kind of jumbled, so please bear with me.
Okay.
I was thinking, so when you were gathering the data for your book, did you come across any language that seemed to be like shared between like Black queer folks and then Black women that weren't like obviously like a case of appropriation, or like this came from this group and then got adopted by this group? And the reason that I asked that is for a couple of reasons. I'm thinking about the phrase a key hell, meaning like don't laugh at me, but also like having a key or like having a key. I'm wondering if those two keys are the same, but also just thinking about how like Black women and Black queer folks are often in community with each other a lot of the time. And then just going back to like, I don't know, Black Southern women in the church. Well, Black queer folks are also like a pillar of the Black church, whether or not the Black community want to acknowledge it or not, and have a lot of influence and have built a lot of sections of the Black church. So I was just thinking about shared like vocab, or like, shared vocab between two groups of Black folks that weren't like clear cases. Okay, this was rooted from this group, this was rooted from this group, but these things are coming up a lot between both groups.
Thank you for your question, Savoya. One of the things that we talk about oftentimes is how queer folks play with gender in like normal conversation. I will reference my friend who is male or non-binary or whomever as cis, S-I-S, not C-I-S. Oh, that's my sister, right? Or the ways that I will use language that I know I always heard from my mom, right? So much of this language that I've learned came from listening to my mom on the phone, right? My mom would be on the phone with her girlfriends, and she would be like, ooh, uh-huh, what? Girl, no. Like, it would always be like all of these things that I would hear her saying all the time. And like, I would find myself starting to say them at school. Now, mind you, as a little gay boy in elementary school, did not always go over well, right? But like, there is a lot of overlap in the ways in which Black women have spoken over the years and how Black queer folks have spoken. And the ways that those things come together oftentimes is really, really interesting. If we think about how Black queer language, a lot of it, we often, in queer communities, we often think about Paris is Burning as a documentary where we can see like where so much Black queer language really kind of like went out into the world. If you're not familiar with Paris is Burning, you've got to check it out. And if you've seen the show Pose, that really centers the story of trans folks in the BALT community. Pose is kind of like a dramatized version of what Paris is Burning was really demonstrating. So there's certainly a lot of overlap there, so I really appreciate that question. Anybody else? Going once? We're almost out of time here, but yeah.
I will ask.
Oh.
We have one more?
Thank you. As you were talking, I was thinking, who do you think are the key stakeholders in the Black church to have an influence on popular culture? Just because when I think of like the Black church's influence on popular culture, I think of music, and pretty much most of like my knowledge about like some of the phrases that you mentioned is through music. So what do you think, or who, if any, do you think are stakeholders in the influence of Black church in popular culture?
A couple of things there. Initially, when I was working on this speech, I was talking about Martin Luther King Jr. a lot more, and I was thinking about how Martin Luther King Jr. at the time that he was around, I was trying to figure out like, oh, well, how did he use black church vernacular in a way that was like influential? And I was like, as I was listening to his speeches and reading his writing, I was like, all of this feels very Black church, right? And there's really not even a distinction to make between like, oh, this was really political and this was church, because Black church is inherently political, right? And so when I think about who the stakeholders are or the people who are kind of like leading that conversation, I think it is really Black churches everywhere. And I don't even think that there are like central figures that we can point to nowadays. I mean, sure, you can point to like the T.D. Jakeses of the world who are like the mega pastors and things like that. But I think what is so important to also remember is, I can't remember who I was talking to about this earlier today, but we have, in the church that I grew up in, Mount Calvary in the Bay Area, there are so many different songs that we sing at church, right? Some were written by the minister of music, some came from the hymnal, some came from, you know, this person moved here and they brought that song with them. But then I go to another church in another state or wherever, and like I will hear songs that like someone will just kind of start singing in the middle of the moment, and like everyone will know it and they will all start singing, and I'll be like, what is this song, right? And then I'm like, oh, am I bad Christian, right? Like, because I don't know this song. So I say that I think it is actually not really centralized in the way that it was, kind of in the same way that we talk about like leadership right now and Black Lives Matter and the ways that we see social movements happening. Like, we don't have like central figures, but I think also we see that's because we see these things happening more regionally, more specifically in different groups and communities, and then going out into culture. So I don't think that we have like those specific kinds of ones of the ways that we used to have. But I think that's also like how culture is now, right? I think about like the age of, you know, Michael Jackson being the most famous person in the world, right? Like that kind of fame doesn't exist anymore, right? Because the culture is so different, because social media, because of the internet, because of the ways that we consume media, because of the globalization of so much of what we put out into the world. So I don't think we have central figures in the way that we used to, but I think if we looked back at the 60s, we would be looking at a Martin Luther King Jr., right? If we were looking at different eras, I think we would see different folks in those ways. Absolutely. Anybody else?
People have been asking you questions and preceding it with, this is going to be a hard question.
Uh-oh.
This might be a hard question. I don't know. I hope it's an easy question.
Okay.
What are some of the phrases that you learned that you didn't know before? And do you have some favorites that went into the book?
So
and what are those?
My co-author, we've been joking about this since we started. My co-author has a few that he says, that they say, excuse me, are from their childhood, and like, oh my God, I always heard. Like, how many of you have ever heard someone say, used to the rooster don't crow no more? Me neither, right? But like this phrase is something that my co-host Travell Anderson, who is an extraordinary journalist, and again, my co-host and co-author, we were talking about, I'm like, I ain't never heard nobody say used to the rooster don't crow no more, and I don't know what that means, right? But well, it's very Southern, right? It was it's from their grandmother who was basically saying like, things are not the way they used to be anymore, right? Like, oh, we don't do that anymore. Oh, well, used to the rooster don't crow no more. And I was like, okay, yeah. And like discussing with people, I was like starting to get that. And there's been a few instances like that where I'm like, I don't know that one. Or I did not say that. Those things did not resonate for me, but like then you put them to other people and they're like, oh yeah, I've heard that before. Or, oh, I used to say that. Or, oh, that makes sense. And so that has been kind of a fun process for me. But they've all come from things that we have either heard or seen, or heard from our families, seen on television, or you know, kind of seen happening in social media. So used to the rooster don't crow no more is one of those that I'm always like, okay, sure. Any other questions here? All right.
And I think we're about perfectly at time. So please give Jarrett Hill one more round of applause.
Thank you.
And thank you all for attending. Thank you to our Zoom attendees on behalf of the Department of Linguistics. Please remember that the MLK Symposium continues on through Monday and really all the way through February. We hope to see you at future Linguistics Colloquia. And if you are visiting with us in person, we would like to invite you to the reception, which is happening in the adjacent room for the next hour or so. Thank you again, and please thank Jarrett again.
Thank you. I appreciate it.